The snow fell softly, the kind of delicate flakes that promised more. But for now, the world was quiet and still. Nadia Celeste stood at the edge of Riverside Park, coffee in hand, earbuds in, lost in her usual Saturday morning routine. But then something caught her eye. There, beneath a blanket of white, a small figure lay motionless, almost swallowed by the snow. At first, Nadia thought it was nothing. The early morning fog and the haze of snowflakes blurred everything around her. But as she took another step, her heart stopped. A tiny hand, pale and cold, stuck out from the snow, fingers splayed open, completely still. Nadia's feet froze, her breath quickened. Without thinking, she rushed over to the small child. His clothes, dark nondescript, were covered in snow, and he barely moved, a faint gasp escaping his lips as he stirred. His face was pale, lips tinged with blue. Nadia knelt, feeling the biting cold of the snow soak into her jeans as she yanked off her coat and wrapped it tightly around him. The weight of his small body crumpled into her chest. Hey, baby, look at me," she whispered urgently, her voice breaking through the cold air. The child blinked up at her, his dark eyes wide and glassy, filled with shock and cold. His small body trembled uncontrollably as he barely registered the world around him. Nadia's heart pounded in her chest as she held him tightly, warmth flooding between them. Without another thought, she picked him up and carried him to the nearby coffee shop at the edge of Riverside Park, her mind racing. The Warm Cup Cafe was a tiny, familiar place, where Nadia had spent every Saturday morning for the past 2 years. Miss Doy, the cafe's owner, knew her by heart. "Miss Doy," Nadia called as she rushed through the door. "I found a boy. He's freezing. We need help." Miss Doy didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, clearing a booth near the heater. Nadia sat down, cradling the boy close, and watched as he took shallow breaths. He was breathing, but barely. His skin was cold to the touch. The boy's lips parted, and in a hoarse whisper he spoke. "Sio? Siaha." Nadia nodded, rubbing his back gently, keeping him warm. Siaha. His name seemed so fragile, like a word he had barely whispered in fear of being heard. As Siaha ate the toast and sweet tea that Miss Doy had brought, Nadia noticed his strange, cautious behavior. He held the food with almost clinical precision, as if he had been trained not to show hunger. Nadia could sense that this child had been through things no child should endure. "Do you know where you live?" Nadia asked softly, trying to get some information out of him. Siaha's answer was vague. He knew his father's name, Guan, and that they lived in a tall building. But when she tried to get more details, he clammed up, eyes wide and wary. As she stood up to make a call, the door to the cafe swung open, and the temperature inside dropped 10 degrees. Nadia glanced up. A man stepped inside, tall, with a charcoal overcoat that screamed wealth and power. His presence sucked the warmth out of the room, and his gaze immediately swept the cafe, scanning every corner with cold precision. Nadia felt her stomach tighten. The man's eyes locked onto Siaha, who went completely still in Nadia's arms. There was a flicker of something, raw desperation, before it vanished behind an impassive mask. "Siaha." The man's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of authority in it, the kind of voice you hear when someone expects obedience. Siaha's body stiffened, his small hands digging into Nadia's sweater. Nadia's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced between the man and the boy. "No," Siaha muttered, pressing his face deeper into Nadia's neck, refusing to let go. His grip tightened. The man, Guan, didn't say another word. He simply walked over, his 2 bodyguards flanking him. Nadia stood her ground. "Sir, he was hypothermic. I found him in the park. He needs medical attention." Guan's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time he really saw her. Something flickered behind his eyes, something raw. Then, in a movement that caught Nadia off guard, he handed her his private business card. "If you would come with me to my penthouse. My son needs more than just a warm drink," he said quietly. Nadia glanced at Siaha, his grip still tight on her. The decision was heavy. This wasn't just about a child in need. The card, his private invitation, felt like something much more ominous, something dangerous that could change her life forever. But Nadia wasn't someone who could walk away from people in need. She looked at Guan. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "But I'll only stay for a little while." What she didn't know was that she had just crossed a line. That small decision, saying yes, would change everything. The tension in the air thickened as she followed him out of the cafe. Outside, a black luxury car awaited them. Siaha clung to her side, his small hand gripping her tightly. As she slid into the car beside him, the doors locked, and the car sped off toward Guan's penthouse. The car ride to the penthouse was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the engine and the faint rustle of Siaha's breath against Nadia's chest. She could feel his tiny fingers clutching her sleeve with a desperation that didn't match his size. The boy's entire body was pressed against her, his face hidden against her side, but his fear, his anxiety, pulsed through her like a quiet storm. Nadia couldn't help but glance out of the car window, feeling the cold bite of the city's skyline through the tinted glass. The night was settling in, but the streets were still lit up with the gleam of neon signs and the hurried pace of city life. Yet here she was, trapped in a black luxury car, speeding through these streets like she was a part of a world she didn't understand. Her heart raced. This wasn't just any child, and this wasn't just any man. The private business card, the way he spoke, the air around him, it was all too much for her to process in one sitting. She looked down at Siaha, his body stiff in her arms, and something inside her stirred. She had worked with kids who came from difficult situations before, but this was different. Siaha wasn't just in need of warmth and care. He was lost, utterly alone in a way that was suffocating him, even as he clung to her like a lifeline. The car slowed to a stop, and Nadia's thoughts were cut short as she looked ahead. A massive, imposing building loomed before them. She wasn't surprised to see it. She had known that this man was wealthy, but seeing it in person sent a shiver down her spine. The penthouse was more than just an apartment. It was a fortress. Guan's voice, calm and commanding, spoke again, pulling her out of her reverie. "Come," he said, opening the door for her as the car parked in front of the entrance. She hesitated for just a moment before nodding and stepping out, Siaha still clinging to her side. As they walked through the entrance, Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much larger than just this moment. Something dark and complicated, a space where emotions were not easily expressed, and silence was the loudest thing in the room. They rode up in a sleek elevator, the sound of their shoes against the polished floor echoing in the otherwise empty space. When the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by an enormous, pristine lobby that smelled faintly of cedar and fresh flowers. The decor was minimal but elegant, a stark contrast to the warmth she had expected from the little boy in her arms. As they walked deeper into the penthouse, Nadia couldn't help but notice how cold the atmosphere felt. There was no warmth, no comfort. The entire space felt like a carefully curated museum, and the absence of life in the space felt like a silent scream. Guan walked ahead, his steps purposeful, his gaze ahead, never once looking back at Nadia. She followed, taking in the vastness of the penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek furniture, and art pieces she couldn't even begin to appreciate. The only thing that seemed out of place was Siaha, who had once been cold, but now he seemed to shrink even further into himself, curling up against Nadia as if he didn't belong in this place. Finally, they reached the living room, which was furnished with expensive leather sofas and a large fireplace that didn't seem to be turned on. There were no family photos on the walls, no signs of life, no personal touches. Just silence. Nadia lowered Siaha onto one of the couches, pulling the soft cashmere blanket tighter around him. She could see his eyes flicker, and for the first time since they had arrived, he made eye contact with her. His gaze was still filled with wariness, but there was also something in it. Something that whispered he wasn't just afraid of being here, but he was afraid of what was about to happen. "Siaha," Nadia whispered, her voice gentle. "You're safe now, okay?" The boy nodded, but his face remained expressionless. Nadia's heart ached. She had dealt with so many children in her career, but none of them had ever looked at her like this, like she was the only one who could hold their world together, but at the same time, like she could shatter it with a single wrong move. Before she could speak again, Guan's voice interrupted. He had been standing near the window, looking out at the city below. He turned slowly to face her. "Can I offer you something?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. Nadia shook her head. "No, thank you," she said quietly, still sitting beside Siaha. "I think it's time for me to leave." But when she stood to leave, something in the air shifted. Guan's gaze was piercing, his expression unreadable. "You are not leaving," he said simply. Nadia froze. "Excuse me. I've invited you here to help my son, but you've helped him in ways that I hadn't anticipated. I don't think you realize how important this moment is," Guan continued, his voice steady. "You're not leaving tonight. Not yet." Nadia stood motionless, staring at the man who had said so little but made it clear that his word was final. Siaha had been silent throughout the conversation, but now, his hand squeezed Nadia's tightly. She looked at the boy, at the sadness and hope in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't just walk away. Not when she had come this far. "I can't stay," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not the right person for this." Guan didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "You're already part of this, Nadia. Whether you want to be or not." The silence between them hung thick and heavy. Nadia felt her breath quicken, her chest tightening with uncertainty. She couldn't run now. She was too far in. Then Siaha, his voice barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "Can she stay?" Guan's face softened just the slightest, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. "I'll make sure she does." The days blurred together after that night in the penthouse. Nadia couldn't remember when she had slept or eaten properly. All she could recall were the hours spent with Siaha, trying to break down the walls around him, piece by piece. The boy was quiet, always observing, but slowly, with each passing day, she felt him begin to trust her. His walls cracked just enough for her to see the terrified child behind the quiet exterior. But there was something else in that penthouse that was just as cold as Siaha had been. Guan. He moved through the house with a practiced stillness, like a man who had learned to become invisible in his own life. He was always there, his presence felt more than seen, a shadow against the wall. He would watch from the corner of the room, never interrupting, his gaze always fixed on Siaha or Nadia, whichever one was in his line of sight. His silence was unnerving, and Nadia could feel the weight of it pressing down on her every time their eyes met. She had told herself she wouldn't get involved. She had told herself that she was here for Siaha, that this was a simple job. But the longer she stayed, the more her resolve weakened. Nadia stood by the window one evening, watching the rain streak across the glass. Siaha was in the living room, playing with blocks, his small fingers carefully stacking them. She knew he wasn't playing for fun. He was trying to build something stable, something safe. She sighed, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned closer. She didn't hear Guan approach, but when his voice broke through the silence, it sent a shiver down her spine. "He's improving, isn't he?" She turned to face him. He was standing there, as still as ever, his hands in his pockets. His eyes were trained on Siaha, but there was a shift in them, something softer, something Nadia hadn't seen before. "Yes," Nadia answered, her voice steady. "He's doing better. But it's slow." Guan nodded but didn't speak. There was a heaviness to the silence that followed, one that seemed to pull at the air around them. Nadia shifted uncomfortably, not knowing what to say next. "You've been good for him," Guan finally said, his voice low, almost unreadable. "I don't know how to thank you." Nadia gave a tight smile. "I'm just doing my job." But Guan didn't seem satisfied with that answer. His gaze softened slightly as he met her eyes. "No, Nadia. It's more than that. You've done more than anyone else could." Her chest tightened at his words, and she quickly turned away to look out the window again. She didn't know how to process what he was saying. She wasn't here to fix him or his son. She was just a therapist. But she had never felt more like a part of something bigger than she did now. "Can I ask you something?" Guan's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Of course," she replied, turning back to face him. "What happened to you?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "You've seen things, haven't you?" Nadia froze. The question felt like a weight that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "I've worked with children. Kids who've been through a lot," she said quietly, carefully choosing her words. "But this isn't just about me. It's about Siaha." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. His eyes were filled with something else now, something deeper. "No, I meant you," he repeated, his voice rough. "What happened to you to make you so strong?" Nadia felt the walls inside her begin to crumble. She hadn't expected him to ask about her. It wasn't something she shared with anyone, especially not someone like him. But there was something about the way he looked at her, something raw and unguarded, that made her feel like he understood. "I've been through things too," she said softly, avoiding his eyes. "But that's not why I'm here." She saw his jaw tighten, and for a moment, she thought he might press further. But instead, he nodded, his gaze softening just a little. "I see. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "You're not," she said quickly, realizing that she had almost pushed him away with her silence. "I just don't talk about it. It's easier this way." There was a long pause, and then Guan spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Nadia." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His words felt like a crack in the dam, and for a moment, she thought she might fall apart. But she didn't. Instead, she simply nodded. I know, she whispered. Guan turned toward the living room, where Sia had finished his game and was now sitting quietly, watching them with wide eyes. I need you to stay, he said, his voice low but firm. Please. For him. Nadia's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away, to return to her normal life. But something about Sia's quiet plea, his need for her, kept her rooted in place. I can't stay forever, she said softly, her voice trembling. I'm not the answer. I'm not who you think I am. But Guan didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Sia, his expression unreadable. I know who you are, he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. You're the one who has been here when no one else could be. That's enough. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Nadia didn't know what to say to that. She didn't know if she was ready to be part of this, to be part of their world. But she knew one thing for sure. Sia needed her. And somehow Guan did too. The days began to stretch longer, each one blending into the next, and Nadia found herself sinking deeper into the rhythm of life in the penthouse. She was no longer a stranger in this space, though the sense of coldness still clung to the place like an unspoken rule. But it wasn't the kind of cold that froze you. No, it was the kind of cold that settled in your bones and stayed there, quiet and relentless. Nadia found herself adjusting, in a way she hadn't expected. She was still Sia's therapist, but somehow, in the little moments between therapy sessions, she had become something else entirely. She had become part of the boy's world. A world that wasn't hers, but one she couldn't quite turn away from. The bond between her and Sia had deepened over the weeks, in small, subtle ways. There were moments when he'd come to her with something in his hand, a paper crane, a half-drawn picture of a dinosaur, and offer it with the same quiet seriousness he had with everything else. He didn't speak much, but his actions had a way of saying everything that his words couldn't. And then there was Guan. Guan had started to change, too. His presence, which had once been so distant and controlled, was slowly becoming more real. She noticed him more now, in the kitchen, making tea without asking, in the living room, sitting silently as Sia played, his eyes following every movement with the intensity of a man who had learned the hard way to not let his guard down. It was on one of these evenings, when the air between them felt like it was thick with unspoken things, that it happened. Nadia was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through some notes from a recent therapy session, when she felt the weight of Guan's presence in the doorway. He hadn't said anything, but she could feel his gaze on her, steady and unwavering. You've been here a lot, he said, his voice low but calm. Longer than you expected, I think. Nadia didn't look up at him immediately. She knew what he was asking, knew the conversation was coming, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. I'm here for Sia, she said quietly, still not meeting his eyes. I can't walk away from that. Not now. Not when he still needs me. Guan took a step forward, his tall frame looming slightly over her as he leaned against the kitchen counter, his arms folded across his chest. I know, he said softly. But what about you, Nadia? What do you need? The question caught her off guard, and she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. His gaze was steady, but there was something in it now, something more personal. Something that told her he wasn't just talking about Sia anymore. I don't need anything, she replied quickly, her voice betraying her discomfort. I'm just here to help him. That's all. Guan's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment he was silent. Then he spoke again, his voice lower this time, as though he were sharing something only meant for her ears. You've done more than help him, he said, his tone soft but certain. You've done something I've never been able to do. You've reached him. Nadia swallowed hard. She wasn't used to hearing those kinds of words, especially not from someone like him. The man who had built his empire with cold, calculated precision. The man who had never once shown vulnerability. You've built a wall around yourself, haven't you? She said suddenly, surprising even herself with the words. You've kept everything locked away so tight that it's become normal to you. But Sia, he sees through it. He sees you, and that's why he's reaching out. He's been waiting for you to see him, too. Guan's eyes flashed with something unreadable, but he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The silence between them stretched on, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of their shared understanding. I'm here, Guan, Nadia said softly, breaking the silence. But you have to be here, too. For him. For yourself. His gaze softened, and he finally nodded. I know. I know. The moment felt like a turning point, a crack in the armor he had worn for years. Nadia didn't know what would come of it, but she felt something shift in the room between them. Maybe it was the beginning of something, or maybe it was just the truth they had both been avoiding. Either way, it was a step forward. And then, as if the tension had suddenly snapped, Guan looked at her with a faint smile, one that was real and unforced. "I've been a fool, haven't I?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nadia shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "We all have our moments," she replied, her heart a little lighter than it had been when she first stepped into his world. That evening, after Siaha had gone to bed, Guan and Nadia found themselves sitting across from each other again, their words no longer measured but flowing with ease. They talked about everything and nothing, about their pasts, their regrets, their hopes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When the conversation slowed, Guan stood and walked to the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the city below. "I didn't expect this," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of all the things he had never allowed himself to say. "I didn't expect you to be so important." Nadia stayed silent, but she felt the truth of his words in her chest. It wasn't just about Siaha anymore. It was about both of them, about the way their lives had begun to intertwine without either of them fully realizing it. "You've changed everything," Guan continued, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "You've made me start believing in things I thought were long gone." Nadia stood up slowly, walking to where he stood, her heart racing. She didn't know what was happening between them, but in that moment it didn't matter. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You've been living in a cage," she said softly. "But it's never too late to break free." Guan turned to her then, his eyes dark and intense, but filled with something else now. Something she hadn't seen before. Without a word, he leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deliberate kiss, as if he were finally allowing himself to feel something real, something he had kept buried for so long. The kiss deepened, and in that moment, it wasn't just about them. It was about breaking down the walls they had built, about the beginning of something neither of them could deny anymore. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Nadia knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something complicated, something dangerous, and something beautiful. Nadia's mind raced with the silence that hung between them. The kiss still lingered on her lips, but it wasn't just the kiss. It was the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The decision she had made, the man she had started to let in, and the boy who had quietly claimed a part of her heart without her realizing it. Guan stepped back, his breath ragged as he pulled away, but the distance between them didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like a moment of recognition. She had never seen him so vulnerable, so raw. The walls he had built around himself had crumbled, brick by brick, until he was standing there before her, completely exposed. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Nadia stood still, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She didn't need him to have all the answers. She didn't need him to be perfect. But she needed him to be real. And in that moment, he was as real as he had ever been. "You don't have to know," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "We'll figure it out together." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if he was trying to read every word she had left unsaid. "I've spent my whole life running from things I couldn't control," he admitted, his voice soft, almost regretful. "But now I can't run anymore." Nadia reached out, her fingers brushing his hand gently. She could feel the heat from his skin, the pulse of life that still coursed through him despite everything he had buried. "You don't have to run," she said softly. "Not anymore." Guan nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something like the acknowledgement of a truth he had been avoiding for too long. He had built an empire from silence, from control. But now, with Siaha's quiet trust and her own unwavering presence, he was beginning to understand that there was more to life than just managing the chaos. In that moment, they both realized that they couldn't turn back. They were standing on the precipice of something they had both avoided for years. Something raw, something real, and something worth fighting for. "You've done the hard part," Nadia said, her voice steady. "Now it's time to let go. To let him in. To let yourself in." Guan's gaze softened, and he slowly closed the distance between them once more. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for the first time, it wasn't a move of control. It was a gesture of tenderness. "I've been so focused on keeping things together that I forgot what it meant to truly be present," he murmured. "But with you, I feel like I can breathe again." Nadia smiled, her heart fluttering with something she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the weight of the past she had carried with her. It was the possibility of a future that she could finally see clearly without fear. And then she made her decision. It wasn't a perfect decision, nor was it the easiest one. But it was the right one. She had never been afraid of challenging what was impossible, and now, more than ever, she felt the same about her own life. "We'll do this together," Nadia said, her voice unwavering. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We're stronger together." Guan nodded, his lips curling into a small but genuine smile. "I think you're right." And just like that, everything shifted. The days that followed weren't easy. There were still walls to tear down, still hearts to heal. But there was something different now, something that wasn't there before. It was the beginning of trust. It was the start of something real. Guan began to change in ways Nadia couldn't quite explain. He wasn't the same man who had invited her into his world, cold and controlled. He had become someone who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to be present, to make room for the love he had buried for so long. Siaha, too, began to bloom in ways that Nadia had hoped for but never truly expected. The small, quiet boy who had walked through snowstorms to find warmth in a stranger's arms was learning to trust again. He was learning that he didn't have to hide behind walls, that he could let people in, even if it scared him. The penthouse, once so cold and empty, began to feel different. It was still grand, still imposing, but now it was alive. It was filled with the small sounds of laughter, of footsteps, of quiet conversations. It was the sound of a family finally coming together. And then one evening, as the first snowfall of winter fell outside the windows, the doorbell rang. It was Siaha, his small feet padding into the living room where Nadia and Guan were sitting on the couch. His eyes were wide with excitement, a piece of paper in his hands. "I made this for you," Siaha said softly, holding out a crayon drawing of a dinosaur. Nadia smiled warmly, her heart swelling at the gesture. "Thank you, Siaha," she said, taking the drawing and admiring it. "It's beautiful." Guan, standing at the doorway, watched them with a small smile on his face. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The walls had come down, not just between him and his son, but between him and his own heart. And as Nadia looked at the drawing, then at the man standing at the door, she realized that this was what life was about. Not the grand gestures, not the perfect moments, but the small, quiet moments where you allowed yourself to let go, to trust, to be loved. The snow continued to fall outside, soft and unhurried, just like everything else in their lives now. The city moved on, unaware of the small revolution that had quietly taken place inside a penthouse apartment, but for Nadia, Guan, and Siaha, it was everything. They had found each other. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't running from anything anymore. They were home.